as way of an introduction, you know, many of you will know this programme is a flagship for the Worshipful Company and its co-funders, the Chartered Institute of Building and the University College of Estates Management. And we've supported over 20 scholars since its launch in 2007. I think we're also all aware now that sustainability agenda itself is not new, but continues to evolve and develop, and it's already impacting on every business and everybody, I expect, in many ways. And that's whether you're interested in carbon accounting for projects, or the importance of water and materials, or managing your waste. The sustainability scholarships really were set up to support professionals to complete research, which will both develop them and their companies, and also allow them to share their findings for wider value to the construction community. I mean, we have a lot of professionals now who actively support the sustainability agenda, but the more we can do to allow others to find out more, and it could be to enhance their own skills and knowledge, or those of the companies, the better. And it really is a learning experience that we're trying to create in the year that the scholars spend with the programme. So we've had a wide and diverse range of topics since the launch of the programme, and actually on our website you can see some of the reports from previous years. And in many cases it's initiated other activities for the scholars and their companies, and also stimulated debate and wider action within our industry, which is also a key driver for the activities. So the topics for tonight's talk, I'm sure, will be no different. So strap yourselves in for a fantastic evening. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Martin Gettings, who will introduce himself and also our first speaker. Thank you, Martin.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Debs. Good evening, everybody. My name's Martin Gettings. I'm Director of Sustainability at Canary Wharf Group. I'm also a member of the Worshipful Company of Constructors, and I'm on their Scholarships Committee. And it's been my pleasure to introduce my learned scholar for the year, Alex Roberts, who I'm very pleased and proud to have been the mentor for the last 12 months or so. And what a journey we went on. Started as a simple mentor-mentee relationship, and it's fair to say that we were both newbies to this particular process. This is the first time that I've mentored within the Worshipful Company, so that was a really interesting eye-opener for myself, as I'm sure it was for Alex as well. But it's also very fair to say that we both learned such a lot, and really that's what it's all about, isn't it? Now, Alex was dealt a blow very early on in the process. He started in employment and then was furloughed and then made redundant. But credit to him, he was determined to make a success of this scholarship, which he has done. And I've got to say, it's always easy to support someone who has a clear vision. And that is what Alex always had on this journey, even seeing it differently from me from time to time, which again is what it's all about. My input was only modest, only introducing Alex to some of the sector leaders in built environment sustainability. But it was Alex who derived the insights and the perspectives to inform this brilliant piece of work, which you'll hear all about in a moment. But through this process, with the other mentors and the other scholars and the scholarships committee, this year we've attempted to, if I could use the word, to codify the process so that future scholars can benefit from the learnings of past scholars. So important that we do that. And as I said, through this process, we learned a lot. But above all, though, and importantly, Alex has delivered something very worthwhile to the sector, no less than answering the following question: how can the construction sector be a catalyst for net zero carbon? Alex Roberts, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. I'm sure that many of us in this virtual meeting room have been part of project teams that have delivered, or maybe we've just worked in, or perhaps we just have a favorite sustainable building. For me, that building is Aurora Finzel's Reach in Bristol. I was part of the project team to deliver that building, And for the contractor that I was working for at the time, it was the most sustainable building we'd ever delivered. After completing the project, I sat back and reflected and asked myself the question of why was that building so sustainable? And my conclusion was because the client asked for it to be. So for those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Alex Roberts, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you today my research findings. And my aim is to give you an insight into the motivations of clients when it comes to net zero carbon. So I hope that you can go away and have earlier, more informed and more impactful conversations on the subject. And I'm going to do that in 3 sections. Firstly, I'm going to explain why it's important to understand motivations and outline the research method that I followed. Secondly, I'm going to outline some of what the academic literature is saying before finally telling you exactly what those motivations are, along with 5 lessons for how the construction sector can speed up its transition to net zero carbon. So section 1. Sustainable development is particularly important to construction. As an industry, we use more than 280 million tonnes of materials a year. We produce more than 100 million tonnes of waste. And the construction, operation and demolition of buildings contributes around 40% of the UK's carbon emissions. So whilst that's a big problem, it's also a big potential for us to be part of the solution as well. But studying motivations is important. Understanding the motivations for striving to achieve net zero carbon can help us to determine whether and how likely these client organisations are to achieve their net zero carbon ambitions. But it can also help us to develop tools and consultancy offerings, and also can help to inform policy and regulation as well. So as I mentioned, my aim was to understand exactly what the motivations were of client organisations that had adopted net zero carbon targets. And I was lucky enough to speak to some fantastic organisations, the likes of M&G Real Estate, Derwent London, the Crown Estate, Exeter City Council, Canary Wharf Group, Peel LLP, the Ministry of Justice, Zero Homes, the Better Buildings Partnership, UK Green Building Council. I spoke with the former chair of the US and World Green Building Council too, as well as having the pleasure of speaking to Mike Barry, who was the former director of Marks and Spencer's Plan A and now a prominent sustainability advisor. And with those individuals, I carried out semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews are a fantastic way of getting in-depth data for analysis, but they do have their shortcomings too. There's a risk of divergence from the question. There's a risk of social desirability. So the interviewees telling the interviewer perhaps what they think they want to hear. So I had to be aware of these when I was analysing my findings. And to analyse my findings, I carried out a thematic analysis. So I was looking for patterns and trends in the data. And with that, I've produced an academic paper as well as an industry playbook. So let's move on to section 2 now and look at and explore what the academic literature is telling us. Now, despite some of the obvious benefits of organisations adopting sustainability and potentially some of the cost savings they might be able to realise, uptake within the built environment has been relatively slow. And the academic literature explores some of the barriers to this. It talks about the barriers of time and cost, and also a lack of client coordination. It talks about a lack of integration between project stages, as well as a lack of understanding and skill, particularly amongst the construction supply chain. They also cite cultural, structural issues as well within industry, such as capital cost and lowest price wins. Now, in terms of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in buildings, one of the earliest and most prominent papers was one in 2003 called Our Energy Future. And I'm just going to read you a quote from that paper that said, "New homes will be designed to need very little energy and perhaps even achieve zero carbon emissions." Just remember, that was in 2003, so that was quite some time ago. But the then Labour government set a zero carbon homes target for 2016 based on that report. However, between 2003 and 16, that policy was slowly dismantled, and it was actually removed in 2016. And the impact of that has been a lack of confidence, I think, in the sector around net zero carbon homes. It's bred a certain amount of uncertainty and risk. And some of the academic commentators are suggesting that because of that, we won't achieve net zero carbon without some regulation, and market forces alone will not be enough. Obviously, more recently, we've seen some changes that are coming in Part L regulation, and also the future home standard that's going to be getting homes zero carbon ready. However, the academic literature does explore some of the issues with focusing just on energy in use, and it talks about a burden shift. So as we work to make buildings and homes net zero carbon in use, there's actually a risk that we put more carbon into the production of these assets. And that's a real issue, because that's carbon that's in the atmosphere now and contributing to the climate emergency as we speak. And it's quite clear that embodied carbon is harder to sell than net zero carbon in use. So we're really going to need regulation and incentive to help move that along. I also explored what the literature was saying around motivations, and it seems that there's 3 key motivations for organizations adopting sustainable development. One is seeking legitimacy. So government and organizations place pressure, government and society places pressure on organizations to adopt sustainable development. Another motivator is the market opportunity. So organizations responding to the behavior of customers and consumers, investors and competitors. And also a third motivation of internal improvement, which is more focused on year-on-year incremental change in efficiencies and cost saving. And many of the papers that looked into these motivators actually found that there were different reasons for the key motivations. So there's a lack of consistency around what exactly are these key motivators. So let's move on to section 3 now, and what exactly are the motivations of these client organizations that have committed to net zero carbon? Well, the first motivation quite clearly was seeking legitimacy. If we think back to a time before COVID-19, when people were protesting, students were striking, local authorities, governments and organizations were declaring climate emergencies, and the UK government enshrined a net zero carbon target into law. And we can really draw a line in the sand around that time where motivations for these client organizations shifted. In fact, one director of a global real estate firm that I spoke to said that there's even a breakfast table pressure. So children are challenging their parents who are investors and asking them, what are they doing to tackle the climate emergency? And that is translating into the sort of decisions that they're making work. But the second key motivation was the market opportunity. And I really think this represents a new era in sustainability, particularly because investors have woken up to the opportunities around sustainable and net zero carbon buildings. They're reading reports and they're becoming aware that these buildings hold their value longer, and they're also more robust assets during downturns. One of the participants said to me that the world is changing. We're operating in an incredibly competitive environment. They said that sustainability is one of those attributes that they believe contributes to a quality building, and it can be a unique selling point to attract like-minded customers. And that is a real motivation for us adopting net zero carbon. That's about the need for a more robust definition of what zero carbon means. They're not exactly sort of assurance, certification, or verify on a level playing field. However, they were keen to stress that the lack of a robust definition is not a reason to stop acting. The second lesson was that we need to consider whole life carbon as well. As I mentioned before, there's that risk of burden shift. But client organizations are struggling to understand how they can influence the market. There is some confusion there, and they want help from the construction industry and the supply chain to help tackle these embodied carbon issues. They also raise the question of who actually owns responsibility for the embodied carbon within the buildings that they're purchasing. The third lesson was that we need some systematic change. It's quite clear from the interviews that I carried out and also the academic literature that voluntary measures alone are not going to help us achieve net zero carbon. In fact, one of the participants said that you have to have policy drivers as well. Very large organizations, such as those that I spoke to, will commit from a reputational point of view, but many others are not at that level, and you need to send signals to the market that change must happen. I think the next lesson is that sustainability is not dead. We can't just focus on carbon. This needs to be part of a wider sustainability and quality offering. In fact, one participant summed this up very well and said that if I'm going to buy a greener building from you, First, it's got to be light, bright, and a brilliant place to be. And by the way, it's also got to be green. They said that in the past, a lot of green marketing has made the mistake of just lazily saying, this is green and you should buy it. I know it's going to cost you a bit more. It looks a bit ugly, but hey, live with it because it's green. And this is fundamentally wrong. No, we need to not lose sight of exactly what it is that we're working towards and make this part of a wider sustainability and quality offering. And the final lesson is that public sector procurement is one of the keys that we can use to unlock and stimulate demand for net zero carbon buildings. We can use it through frameworks and through public sector procurement to drive and improve that understanding and skill amongst the construction industry and its supply chain. I think what's clear though to me through this research is that the net zero carbon ship is sailing. These early adopters are well on their journey and they see it as embracing a future that's going to happen anyway. And those organizations that are failing to embark on the net zero carbon journey do risk getting left behind. I think just at this point, Craig is just going to share a slide just as I summarize my presentation for you, just putting across those key points. So my first section, I talked about the reasons why we should study motivations for striving to achieve net zero carbon. And I outlined my research method that used semi-structured interviews and also a thematic analysis. I then outlined the findings within the academic literature that explored some of the barriers to adopting sustainability and net zero carbon. And we also touched on the policy dismantling of the net zero carbon target for 2016 that has led to some uncertainty and risk within the sector. We also then touched on the need to consider embodied carbon as well as carbon in use. And then we touched on the different motivations and the lack of consistency within the literature as to what those motivations actually are. I then moved on to share with you the two key motivations for client organizations in adopting net zero carbon. Number one was seeking legitimacy. So governments and society places pressure on organizations to adopt sustainability and net zero carbon. And the second motivator, which was the market opportunity in this new era that we're entering with investors showing an interest in sustainability. I then shared 5 lessons for how the sector can transition towards net zero carbon. Number one, to agree a definition for net zero carbon. Number 2, to always consider whole life carbon. Number 3 is that systematic change and the need for policy and regulation. And number 4 was that sustainability is not dead and this needs to be part of a wider sustainability and quality offering, before finally saying that public sector procurement is one key that we can use to unlock net zero carbon. Thanks, Craig.
Okay. So thank you very much, Alex. I think there's a virtual round of applause going on in the background now. We can't actually hear it or see it, but I'm sure it's all taken place there. So we've got a few minutes now. We're a little bit ahead of program. You see the claps coming in. That's great. Thanks very much, everybody. We've got a few minutes now for questions. Just before we open it up to the floor, I'm gonna pose you a question, Alex. So get ready because we haven't rehearsed this one. Really appreciated the fact that you spoke to a number of clients in the sector. How can we get the message? And it's clear the clients want this. How do we get this message to the constructors? How can we help? Put the message out there that we need to make this connection. The clients want these zero carbon buildings. Have you got any thoughts on that, please?
I think the first thing is just to have the discussion. Based on my experience, I've spent a lot of time, sat in perhaps industry roundtables where I've been sat with other contractors, design consultants, architects, M&E consultants. We've all been sat around the table talking about these issues, and quite often the person that's missing from that discussion is the client. I don't feel like we're collaborating enough and opening that conversation enough to all talk about the opportunities and the challenges together.
That's great, thanks. Now I'm sure there must be a couple of questions from the floor. Has anybody got a question for Alex Ritzen here, just specifically research it. The microphones come off. Don't think we've got any questions from the floor on this one, Alex. I think you've wowed them.
I think there's one that just came through. Let me just in the chat. VJ.
Yeah, we see this. Yep.
Might need to unmute your mic.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just posted the question, but I just want to know what your uptake, what's your understanding on private clients taking up BIM to help in the net zero project. So, you know, obviously the creating of a twin before the construction, and then kind of embodied carbon in that, and then obviously the long-term life during the life of the asset for the facilities managers to kind of reduce the you know, the carbon emissions from running the asset. How do the private clients, because obviously there's legislation to kind of get local government and central government to do major to incorporate BIM in major projects, but in terms of private clients, how do you see their uptake on that?
Yeah, so in terms of actual uptake from clients with BIM, I didn't ask that question. I didn't explore that, but there obviously is a huge potential for understanding, you know, through the model, through tagging those assets as to, you know, what the embodied carbon is of those materials, and then using that early on in the design stage to perhaps design out carbon. I think there's a real opportunity as well as energy in use, particularly if some of these asset owners are looking to lease or to rent out their space. In terms of managing that performance gap, you know, it's a big issue we've got as a sector. Buildings don't operate as they're designed. But, you know, if we do some detailed modelling of how the building should perform in use, and then carry out post-occupancy evaluation and sort of tweak how the building is used, we can certainly work to close that gap. But both of those issues, the embodied carbon and the energy in use, you know, they're both key. They're both significant sections, you know, contributions of carbon emissions.
I mean, that might be something that we come back to in the Q&A roundtable, actually, because I'm sure there's a few people in the audience who've got experiences of that. I'm conscious that Martin might have trouble with his bandwidth, so to speak. So did Aled Williams, did you have your hand up? Or
I did. I think Alex may have answered my question, so thank you for an excellent presentation, Alex. But it's about agreed approaches to in-use performance evaluation and whether we can share that collectively, because I think that's the only way we're going to move, change the dial. And that kind of hints at the question that's been asked by James Ritzen as well, that most of the buildings are existing buildings, and how can we, you know, move that forward?
Oh, sorry, I missed the end of that question.
Sorry, the question is, in terms of performance modelling, yeah, how can we encourage the industry and clients and building owners to share actual performance in use? Because it's one thing, as you say, having how materials should perform. As we know with Grenfell, it's all about how materials perform in combination. So do you think there's value in moving forward in kind of developing a shared evidence space so we can move forward on a more informed basis?
Oh, yeah, no, certainly, yeah. But, you know, obviously then we have the ability to compare similar buildings and compare similar sort of performance, you know, as they're operating in use. And yeah, well, you know, why not? How do we get there? I don't know. I don't know, but it's I just think a distinct barrier to this is a lack of collaboration at the moment, and perhaps a lack of sort of transparency around a lot of these discussions. And just by opening them up and having, you know, conversations about it is certainly going to be the way forward.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, I don't know whether or not Debs is, if you can hear us, I'm assuming you can. But I think we need to move it on now. We'll pick up all of these questions again in the Q&A. We've got a 20-minute Q&A session coming up. let's do that. I've made a note of the questions in the chat, and we'll definitely cast them forward. And Bob, I saw your hand was up, but we'll come back to you in the Q&A. That's all right. It's a very popular topic. So I'm gonna go back over now to I think we're gonna hand over to Chris, and you're going to introduce your scholar now. Is that right, Chris?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Martin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Chris Turner, and I'm a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Constructors and a member of the Scholarship and Awards Committee. And like Martin, this is my first year through the process as a mentor. As an acoustician by profession, the topic which you're about to listen to this evening appealed to me as a designer. As part of my work, designing for sustainability is not easy. Stopping sound in buildings generally involves large amounts of concrete or large amounts of mineral wool and fresh gypsum board. A toolkit like this could be beneficial for my profession, as well as that in which it was developed. It's my pleasure then to introduce Safak. Safak graduated from the University of Bristol in 2018 with a first-class honours degree in civil engineering and has been employed as a graduate design engineer at Tony G and Partners. He's worked on various major infrastructure projects across the UK, such as the Midland Metro Alliance, the A361 improvement, and the Transpennine route upgrade, Manchester to Leeds. Safak's interest in sustainable development was sparked at university, where he took a module in sustainable development and joined Engineers Without Borders. With Engineers Without Borders, he designed a rainwater harvesting system for a hospital in Benin. He continued his interest in sustainable development by joining the Sustainability Design Group at Tony G and Partners, as well as volunteering to be the Environmental Management System representative. This topic was chosen by Safak as circular economy because the take-make-waste model the industry currently operates is unsustainable, and we must take ownership for improving the current way which we source our materials. There is very little consideration or discussion about what happens to materials once an asset has reached the end of its design life, particularly on permanent work projects. It feels irresponsible for design engineers to not consider how these elements, which we design, can be disassembled for reuse or recycling. Safak has researched how we can integrate circular economy into infrastructure projects and developed a design and decision-making toolkit for design engineers to use and measure the circularity of different design solutions so that the optimum circular design can be selected. So without any further from me, it is my privilege to introduce Safak Muslu.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'll just start off by sharing my screen, as this is, oh, sorry, Craig, it says here the host disabled screen sharing. Are you okay to enable that?
I've done so, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, everyone, hopefully that's all come through now.
Safak, could you enable your video, please?
Yep, sorry. Come on. There we are. Is that all coming through now?
Excellent, yeah.
Fantastic. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful evening. And I'd like to start off by thanking everyone that has joined us here today. My name is Safak Muslu, and I'm a graduate engineer at Tony G and Partners. Throughout 2020, I've had the privilege of researching circular economy and infrastructure and developing a decision-making toolkit that I hope will instill circular economy principles to infrastructure projects. This evening, I will be going over my research, specifically focusing on the toolkit that I've developed and discussing its key features and benefits. Sorry, it's all paused. Sorry, I'll just have to reshare again. There we are. Sorry about that. I will begin by outlining the definition of circular economy and explain why it is an ideal candidate for replacing the existing take-make-waste model that is currently used with regards to material usage in construction and infrastructure projects. I will then discuss the principles of design for disassembly and its pivotal role in delivering circular economy into infrastructure. This will then lead on to discussing the development of the toolkit and summarize the results gathered from trialing it on a project. Lastly, I will explain the future steps I will be taking to improve the toolkit and end with a summary of the presentation. So without further ado, let's introduce you to circular economy. Circular economy is defined as one that is restorative and regenerative by design, and which aims to keep products, components, and materials at their highest utility and value at all times. So how is this relevant to infrastructure? Construction materials and how they are managed currently operate under the take, make, waste model, which is the process of taking raw materials and transforming them into products that are used until they are finally discarded as waste. This, by definition and currently in practice, is not deemed sustainable. A few problems. Construction waste increases the burden on landfill sites, which are becoming increasingly scarce. Furthermore, the UK construction industry uses a staggering 400 million tonnes of natural resources each year. And with the UK population continuing to rise, there is ever more demand for new infrastructure to facilitate urban development. But what happens when we inevitably run out of the raw materials and can no longer have the space to dispose of our waste? How will we be able to then build the infrastructure that is needed to keep society functioning? This is where I believe design for disassembly comes into the conversation. Design for disassembly, which I will now refer to as DFD, is defined as designing products so that it can be easily, cost-effectively, and rapidly taken apart at the end of the product's life, so that components can be reused and recycled. The concept is built on the ideals of material recovery, value retention, and meaningfulness in the next use. This makes it an ideal enabler of circular economy for design engineers such as myself. So we've established what circular economy is, why we need it, and how DFD can be used to integrate circular economy into infrastructure. This alludes to two important questions. How do we know what design solution is best from the perspective of circular economy? And is there a way we can measure the circularity of a design solution from a material selection point of view? So this leads us on to the toolkit that I've developed to tackle these two very important questions. The purpose of the toolkit is to enable the design engineering team to successfully determine the most circular design from the perspective of maximizing material recovery and optimizing value retention. The toolkit is a checklist system that a design engineer will use to score and rank each design option for a project. The final score will vary between 0 and 1, with 0 representing a completely non-circular design and 1 representing a completely circular design. The checklist was based upon the figure you can see on your screen. The figure outlines the chronological order that materials will take to form the infrastructure assets we see today. To prevent these materials being sent to landfill after the asset has reached the end of its design life, we introduce 4 alternative paths that reintroduce the materials to a previous stage. And these are recycling of the material, reprocessing of the material, reuse of the material, and finally reuse of the entire element. For each of these paths, I've created a total of 4 guidelines, and these guidelines consist of a list of deliverables that a material must achieve to ensure it can be reintroduced back into its previous stage. The process of completing the checklist for each material that you're considering for a design option is very simple, as it only requires the user to respond yes or no for whether or not the material achieves a certain deliverable. A snapshot of a completed checklist can be seen on your screen. Once this process is completed, the fraction of deliverables that were answered with yes is determined and is used to score the material. This will be the metric that the toolkit uses to measure the circularity of materials and design option, which I have defined as the DFD index. To understand the process more clearly, I will now go over an example with you. We start off by outlining the design option we are considering for a project. We then break the option down into its key materials. In this case, we are considering 2 materials. For each material, we complete the checklist, and the fraction of deliverables for a given guidance that is answered with yes, i.e. can be achieved, is determined. This is then used to score the final DFD index of that material. We can see in this scenario, material 2 achieves a higher DFD index and is therefore deemed more circular. In order to work out the DFD index of the design option we are considering for a project, we calculate the mass fraction of the two materials. In this scenario, materials 1 and 2 makes up 10 and 90% respectively of the total mass of the design option we're considering in our project. We then multiply the DFD index and mass fraction of each material and finally sum the two products to give us our final DFD index. So we've created a system that measures the circularity of a design option, but does it actually work? To answer this, I trialed the toolkit on a project I've worked on this year and qualitatively assessed the results. The project that I've used was the Midland Metro Alliance Wednesbury to Brierley Hill expansion. The scope of the project was to design a retaining wall that would allow a new tram line to be installed. This involved the removal of material from the toe of an existing slope, which would therefore require the installation of a retaining wall. The 5 options we considered in this project was option 1, a sheet pile wall solution, which is just made of steel. Option 2, a king post wall with pre-cast concrete panels, which is made of reinforced concrete, steel piles, and granular fill. The third option is a king post wall, but with timber panels rather than a reinforced concrete panel. The fourth option that we considered was a contiguous pile wall, which is just made up of reinforced concrete and granular fill. And finally, a concrete gravity wall, which is made of the same materials as option 5. You may have also noticed that from options 2 to 5, excavator material is also considered in this analysis. This is the material needed to be removed from the ground to install the wall. So on to finding out if the checklist works or not. The following 5 pie charts outline the mass fraction of each design option we considered. At the center of each pie chart, we have the total mass of that option. In order to represent the DFD index of each material considered for an option, I've used a color contour system where red indicates a DFD index of 0 and the green represents a DFD index of 1. Using the process that I went through earlier on with you, the following 5 figures outline the DFD index of the design options we're considering in this project. The results show that the sheet pile wall, which is option 1, achieved the highest DFD index, but option 4, the contiguous pile wall, achieved the lowest. So we can see that the sheet pile wall achieved the highest score. But can we say it's the most circular? One factor that supports this argument is that the benefit of using a sheet pile wall over the rest of the options is the use of mechanical over adhesive connections, which means the sheet pile wall can be easily disassembled and reused, which is in complete contrast to the contiguous pile wall. The sheet pile wall is also inherently modular, unlike the rest of the options, particularly compared to options 4 and 5. Being a modular design and being made of steel, it improves its chances of being reused and recycled. Another key driver as to why option 1 achieved the highest DFD index over the rest of the options was the influence of excavator material. For the purpose of this trial, the excavator material was assigned with a DFD index of 0, which is equivalent to saying all excavator material is to be sent to landfill. Sheet pile walls are installed by driving the piles into the ground, negating the need to excavate any material to install them. This assumption ensures that the checklist upholds the importance of waste reduction, which is a major feature of circular economy. We can therefore assume with some confidence the toolkit provides an accurate reflection of circularity of the design option and provides decision makers the correct answer. There were 2 very important assumptions made in this analysis. The first, as previously mentioned, was that all excavator material was to be sent to landfill. Hence, it was assigned with a DFD index of 0. Second, was that both buried and unburied material were considered to be reusable or recyclable. However, it is becoming ever more common for excavator material to be recycled. It is also very uncommon to dig out buried material, and so the likelihood that it can be reused is extremely low. So to understand the impact that this could have on the toolkit, a sensitivity analysis was done assuming the following. Firstly, we assign a DFD index of 0.1 to the excavator material to reflect the assumption that it is fully recyclable. And secondly, we assigned a DFD index of 0 to all buried material. We first see the summary of results for each option before the sensitivity analysis was undertaken. The bar chart represents the mass fraction of each material, and we've mirrored the same color contour system that was used in the previous slide. We then introduce the following figures, which are a summary of the results for each option after the sensitivity analysis was undertaken. We see that in this scenario, option 1, the sheet pile wall solution, still comes out on top, but experiences the largest drop in the final DFD index. However, for option 5, though marginal, we actually see an increase in the final DFD index. So what does this all mean? The results highlight the importance of not only reducing the volume of excavated material, but encourages optimizing the value of excavation by recycling it in order to maximize circularity in your project. It also highlights the importance of limiting the volume of buried material and focusing on accessibility of materials and elements to ensure we can monitor and disassemble as much material as possible. The sensitivity analysis also highlights the limitation of the toolkit. As we've seen in option 1, assuming an element can't be disassembled and reused elsewhere dramatically diminishes its value in terms of circularity. What the toolkit does not capture is a guideline that could improve the possibility of reusing it while the element stays at the same location. An example of where this is practiced is in the building industry, where many high-rise extension and refurbishment schemes aim to reuse the existing pile foundations to support the proposed works, and has proven to be a massive saving in material usage. Another key aspect of the toolkit is stakeholder engagement. For each achievable deliverable, the user must outline who the designer must engage with to ensure the deliverable comes to fruition. In general, it was found that contractor will play a pivotal role in achieving deliverables that optimize constructability, waste reduction, and material security. The supplier and manufacturer play a prominent role in providing key information such as life cycle data about the materials. And finally, the client played a limited but extremely valuable role in storing information, ensure trackability of assets, and take ownership of the responsibility for making sure the element is reused or recycled. So one of the main steps I would like to take is to introduce a new guidance that will capture the benefits that reuse without relocating the elements can have on the overall circularity of projects. I would also like to use the toolkit on a bridge design project to test the versatility of the toolkit. Moreover, I am keen to learn about the extent of improvement that the toolkit can have on improving value retention and optimizing resource efficiency. I would also like to take the time to develop a grading system that can be used to tell the user whether or not a design is compliant with CEQAL guidances. So in summary, circular economy and infrastructure is a perfect and sustainable alternative to the current take-make-waste model that is causing massive strains on our environment, our economy, and society. Design for disassembly is a key enabler for design engineers to incorporate circularity to their designs. To achieve this, I developed a toolkit to measure the extent of circularity in design solutions to ensure the client picks the most easily disassembled design. The research showed that the toolkit improved comparability between designs by successfully assigning a metric to measure the circularity of different design solutions. I intend to continue with developing the toolkit to iron out any faults so that it can provide as much value to infrastructure to secure a sustainable future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Safak. I think that also deserves a virtual round of applause. And there are some actual ones on camera and the ones on. Are there any questions for Safak?
Hi, I've got one. I don't know if I can jump in.
You may.
Hi, Saf. Really good presentation. Have you got like a summary sheet which says how you can use the DFD index? I think I followed the presentation, but if there was just a quick sheet that says how to actually give it a go yourself on a project, that'd be quite useful.
It would. Once I start testing it a little bit more, kind of ironing out all the faults, what I'll then do is, if we're going to use it commercially, especially at Tony G, the spreadsheet or the toolkit will come with its sort of instructions. If you'd like to read the paper more and learn a bit more about these deliverables that I've come up with, there are descriptions for each of these deliverables that can enable any user to pick up and use. But I'm more than happy to send you the toolkit itself after this presentation.
Yeah, sounds good. I guess if you come to a point where you're fairly happy to share a toolkit, I'd be interested. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexa.
Any other questions? John in the chat, I don't know if you've seen that, Safak, so asks, is the future of the checklist to expand to the use of existing assets in proposed designs in addition to end-of-life impacts?
Sort of. So there are already kind of existing guidances on existing assets. To name but one, I believe there is one on reusing foundations. But actually today, I was thinking about that today actually, and about developing the toolkit to pick up, say, for example, waste that you produce. So in this research, I just automatically assigned the excavated material with either a 0 or 0.1 or whatever, based on a very big assumption. Because, as I've alluded to, the toolkit is on materials we are introducing to the environment. I would advise that that's more about waste management, in terms of what you're alluding there, I think, about existing assets. Particularly if you're looking at assessing the reusability of that asset. To be honest, I've worked on a project previously where we had construction material already on site, where we raised very early on that they could reuse certain materials on site that's already there. At this stage, making those sorts of improvements to your project from the perspective of circular economy can come from just conversations with the client, with the contractor. It's very easy to identify being able to reuse materials on site that's already there. But of course, yeah, developing the toolkit so they can pick that up as well would be very much welcomed.
Thanks, Safak. And John asked the follow-up question. Are there any limitations included in the toolkit due to corrosion or fatigue in material at the end of life?
Yes. So one thing that I did notice is the way in which I've developed the guidances. There are a total of 4 guidances. To pick the 2 extremes, guidance 1 is about recycling. So as you've alluded to about corrosion, being able to recycle something that's corroded over 100 years is a lot more likely than, say, reusing that element. The issue with buried material is that it will corrode due to chemical reactions. So the probability, even though reuse is opted over recycling, something like that, for example, the environmental impact over 100 years is something we need to consider as well. Maybe if circular economy starts to pick up traction, maybe if the client can see the big value in making sure that, that their assets are maintained well, stuff like, for example, double coating the material so they've got better protection against corrosion, may cost more in the short term, but will have a greater value in the long term. So what I'm trying to say is that if we can better maintain our assets and provide it with protection against these sort of natural attacks on the asset, then that will be great for circular economy.
Thanks, Safak. We've got time for just one more, and question from Donna in the chat says, how have you found feedback from contractors to this model? Have you tested it on others?
Unfortunately not, no. It's one of those things that I alluded in my future steps is to take it to contractors, but specifically take it to a resource efficiency workshop, which is an incentive that's quite recently started to pick up traction in infrastructure projects, specifically to look into actually quantifying the value that it can bring to the project. So no, I haven't as of yet, but that's sort of the next steps to take.
Thanks, Safak. I believe am I handing over to you, Anna? Or is it back to Deb?
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. That's fantastic. Apologies if my internet is dips out. Hopefully it will be okay, and I'll be able to stay live. So yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm Anna Kakulis. I'm the Head of Social Value and Equality, Diversity, Inclusion for Wilmot Dixon Interiors. As a former scholar myself, it's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening as a yeoman with WCC and also a member of the Scholarship Committee. It's been phenomenal working with Alex and Safak and the wider team, and I've been really quite blown away by the research, which I'm sure we'll all agree adds immense value to the topic of sustainability in the built environment. So we wanted to create a session, and over the next 20 minutes, I'd like to welcome our scholars back, Safak and Alex, and also guest panelists, Anna and James Ritzen. I know Martin's having some troubles with it, but hopefully. So before we get, I'd just like to introduce our guest panelists. So we're really pleased this evening to welcome James Ritzen, who is currently the Programme Leader for Building Surveying at University College of Estate Management. James is an expert member of International Council on Monuments and Sites, the UN Advisory Group on World Heritage, and Vice President of the International Scientific Committee on Energy and Sustainability. And he has published widely on sustainability of the existing built environment. So UCM are sponsors of this scholarship, and we're absolutely delighted that James could join us this evening to offer his expertise on the topic of sustainability. So very warm welcome to James. James is joined by our very own livery members and scholarship mentors. Thanks, James. Martin Gettins, who is Director of Sustainability for Canary Wharf, and Chris Turner, who is Principal Consultant for Adnet Acoustics, and of course our Chair, Deborah Pullen. So this session is an opportunity to open the debate. So what we would ask the audience is, if you have any questions for our scholars, please do raise your hand or drop your comments in the comment box, and I'll do my very best to flip through and field those questions. We only have 20 minutes for the session, so if I could kindly ask that questions are kept short so that we can try and get round to as many questions as possible. Okay, so I'd love to start first coming back round to Alex's paper around net zero carbon buildings. And I know, Bob, you actually had a question initially in the first session. So I just wondered if you wanted to open up with your question, Bob.
You're on mute.
Currently on mute.
I'm not on mute now. Now you can hear me. Yeah, in fact, it's a question really,
there we go,
for both Alex and Safak. Safak, firstly, great presentation, as indeed Alex's was as well. So congratulations to you both. If I was from a contractor's perspective now, looking at the both examples that you put forward and the various models on the, let's say, choice of retaining walls, etc. How would you respond to a contractor that clearly has a design and build tender to put forward that could look at, let's say, the various alternatives, the various 5 or 6 different methods, and looking at your model, sheet piling came out the most sustainable, but was the most expensive in his tender? How would you respond to the contractor there that clearly putting in let's say to the extreme, the most expensive option as opposed to the cheapest option would be that he wouldn't get the contracts in the first place.
That's very true. It will depend on the type of works. If it was a temporary works design, I would immediately say that because a sheet pile wall is much more easily disassemblable, it's modular, it can be relocated to different sites. If you're looking to value that, if you're looking to cost that one particular project and you find that a sheet pile wall is most expensive, I could easily argue and say, but because you can take that sheet pile wall and reuse it on another site, and then reuse it on another site, and then reuse it on another site, especially if it's a temporary works design, or essentially you can just reuse it on different types, different projects. What I'd argue there is that you're building the value of that sheet pile. So the cost on that project, because then you're able to relocate and reuse that same sheet pile wall on another project, the cost on material use on that next project is significantly reduced. So I understand that I understand if we were to assume that the sheet pile that you've just got on the sheet pile wall, and I understand that that's going to be using it the first time is going to be most expensive, but then using it the second, the third, the fourth time, it's going to be cheap on those projects, if that makes sense. For permanent works,
yeah, that's
more different. It's a bit more different with permanent works. I understand that one of the big limitations about circular economy in construction is that we design things typically to 60 to 120 years. By the time 120 years comes around, we don't know who the owner of that asset is going to be. So that's why circular economy, I definitely think there's a very strong argument that integrating circular economy into temporary works is very easy. There's a great argument there, great foundations to build on. But with permanent works, it's going to be a bit more challenging. As John Gocher alluded to about corrosion, trying to maintain the quality of assets for 100 years plus, it's very challenging, very challenging.
Thanks, Safak. I'm going to just invite Alex into that to see if you've got anything to add, and then I'd like to widen that discussion to Martin and James. So Alex, over to you if you'd like to add anything to that question.
No, nothing specifically.
Okay, fine. Well, look, I mean, before we dive into kind of some of the cost barriers associated with sustainability, something that really came out quite loud and strong from Alex's report actually was around, and I wrote it down, market opportunity, a new era. And that sort of, got me quite excited. And I just wondered, Martin, do you see that this is a new era of sustainability and that people are starting to think more about that value engineering exercise? And then I'd love to come over to James for his reflections on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, Anna. I think one of the things that we've got to be mindful of here, it's almost unfair to ask the contractor for the, to work out the pricing on this. This is a whole societal shift in values that's going on at the moment with things like the Sustainable Development Goals, with the work that Mark Carney's doing with the financial world. There is a massive shift going on right now with ESG. Alex, you used the term, the ship is sailing, right? It absolutely is. And we as a sector need to start thinking differently. This isn't about the contractor that puts the price in that gets the job. Okay, that is still one foot in the past. That is still the way that a lot of the, we're thinking at the moment. But clients and financial banks, the people who are financing these projects, they only want to talk about ESG. It's absolutely taken off at the moment. And as a sector, we are the ones who are going to deliver this. It's a brilliant opportunity to get to, to really embrace and get on board with this right now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Martin. And James, I know that you have a slightly different spin on things, having a wider international viewpoint on these topics. So, I mean, what's your experience in terms of the market opportunity and that shift in mindset and heart set?
I think it does. I mean, it's a very interesting one in the sense that, exactly as you said, in the current framework, it does make it very difficult for a contractor, like you say, to make a more expensive in pounds, pence, dollar, and cent bid, but saying he's sustainable. I think it's also to do with how materials and manpower are valued. And I think that's really one of the questions that I'm really looking at some of the presentations, is that within the context, sometimes it's not the cost of the material, it's the manpower involved in extracting that material, storing it, and all the other externality costs. Where what I've noticed in international markets, particularly developing markets and newly developed markets, materials are expensive, people hours are cheap. And so recycling happens at a much greater level. And I think that that's a very interesting way that maybe we view things, that perhaps what we have to start considering is, I would like our panelists to reflect on this, is the way that we view things is we consider materials to be too cheap and therefore to throw away, something we can throw away, but actually we are seeing that cost now in environmental terms. And that's something that I think is quite, it is changing, but I do take the audience's comment about, well, how would you expect someone to do that? But I think it's, in a way, internationally, there are areas where this is done already because materials are so expensive. So the circular economy happens because it's so much cheaper to do that financially. Is it because of the way we value materials solely on the financial cost rather than the environmental cost? I just wonder what Safak's feelings on that are.
Ooh. I mean, a lot of good points there, James.
Sorry, put you on the spot.
No, I think we need a. It's not. We
just
need a
double
whole
checking. James, I think you might have broke up there.
Oh, I apologise. Did I break up?
No, I heard.
No, it was all good, all received. Carry on, Safak.
All received. No, I think we need a whole social sort of psychological shift in how we value materials. As you stated there, the more. I mean, I'm always told I'm quite a cheapskate, if I'm completely honest. I always go for the cheapest option, but then I'm living the consequences 2-3 days after it's broken down, and then I've got other friends who go for the more expensive option, but you know they're enjoying whatever they've bought to this day. So I do think we need to start appreciating that the more money we put into something, the more we're more likely to take care of it. And it's kind of what I was trying to get on with what I was saying previously, is that the more money a contractor will spend on a material, the more likely they're going to want to take care of it and want to actually, now that they've invested into it, they're going to look to find values elsewhere for it. There's a project I've been working on recently where I was told that imported granular fill is really difficult to come by these days. Now, as I said previously, they're starting to recycle excavator material more. So possibly in the next 5-10, if we were practicing this beforehand, maybe we wouldn't have had this issue where we're essentially there's limited resources. So I think we should start to see that if we can, if for example we're demolishing an asset and typically sending it off to landfill, all the waste was previously being sent to landfill. Now that we're starting to see the value in recycling these materials, it's going to start putting less strain on virgin materials as well. And the market is volatile as well. So if we can kind of stabilize that by introducing recycled materials and kind of replacing raw materials, then that would be great, I think, for the market as well.
So Safak, I'd just like to jump in there. Martin, I will come to your question in a second, but just picking up on something you said about shifting mindsets. And I wanted to come to Alex on this. You know, you spoke a lot about cultural and structural challenges, and mindsets is part of that. How do we challenge businesses and contractors to start changing this sort of mindset? What do we need to start doing?
I think there's probably a couple of ways we could do that. First, it's perhaps around a perception of value. and seeing more than just the capital cost, particularly if a contractor is going to be delivering a project for somebody who's going to hold on to that asset for the long term. They could see that an investment in the capital cost could pay off in the long term. But I also think that, there's certainly some sort of policy drivers that policy levers that could be pulled to influence this as well. Whether it's perhaps some sort of carbon tax linked to this fundamentals of sustainability, environmental management in terms of polluter pays principle. Could that start to shift mindsets as well? I saw a study today that I think was published in The Guardian that said as part of building back better after the pandemic, the majority of the public would support a carbon tax. So, maybe that's a way that we could start to shift mindsets.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Martin, I'm going to open up to your question now, and then I'm going to ask some specific questions that we've had from the audience. So if you're happy to come in here, Martin.
Yeah, perfect. And it was really just to follow up on that conversation we were having around value. And I really wanted to give Alex a chance to share with us the client's perspective that he'd gleaned from many of the discussions that he'd had. I know that you spoke to a lot of different clients, Alex, but I got the impression that there was a theme starting to emerge that clients were prepared to accept that they wanted this new value system, that they wanted it. Can you just share some of the insights? I mean, particularly Mike Barry, that when he mentioned about the sustainable buildings having a different intrinsic value now, I think that would be quite helpful for the audience tonight.
No, he was talking about the, first and foremost, let's just make good buildings. Let's make them nice places to be, warm, bright, cost effective to run, and then also make them sustainable at the same time, and not lead in with that sustainability offering first and foremost to make this part of a wider, more holistic approach to sustainability. So thinking about well-being and, perhaps if it's an office environment, how productive are people in that space? Thinking about maintenance and cost efficiencies of running the building, thinking about end of life, thinking about biodiversity and ecology, and really embracing all of those aspects of sustainability and not just focusing on carbon and energy costs, because there's a wider value to this as well. And that spans across from offices to homes to residential areas to hospitals. It covers all sectors of the markets that we operate in.
Great. Alex, we had a few specific questions for you earlier, so I'm just going to go through those. So there was one here from John, which was, do clients looking for net zero buildings vary by use, i.e. offices, not homes? And is there a difference in maturity in other sectors?
Yeah, I and this perhaps leads on from what I was saying just now. There, certain sectors are mature. I think real estate is maturing quickly. I think because of that drive from investors, because there's that long-term asset value associated with sustainability and net zero carbon. Likewise, in some of the public sector organizations, they see a long-term value as well. Perhaps that is because they're going to be occupying an asset for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Investing up front to reduce energy costs and reduce carbon does pay back. In terms of homes and housing, that's perhaps, that's got some development, some maturity to go through, but I think that's going to be driven by regulation through future home standard and future part of regulations as well.
Brilliant, thanks for that. There was a slightly different question from Simon, which I'd like to field to James, if that's all right. So Simon said that he learnt this morning about Neighbours, hope I've said that right, which has been very successful in Australia, and how is it being introduced into the UK as a measure for building energy performance improvement? So there was a bit of a discussion around that. I mean, James, did you want to jump in there on that?
I'm afraid I can't comment on that particular system myself. I think one of the big challenges that we do face, undoubtedly, internationally, is not just what's being built already, but actually what we've already got. And this chart makes a really interesting, it draws onto both presentations, that this has obviously, it follows the 3 pillars of sustainability. It has a cultural relevance, it has an economic relevance, and obviously an environmental relevance. And I think that there are a number of ways that we need to look at, as you said, the embodied carbon, the way that we measure this. What do we mean by net zero? And I think that's a very good question for Alex to follow up on. This one is, you know, what do we mean by net zero carbon? There are so many various definitions internationally, and even nationally, there was no agreement on what is meant by that terminology. I think that what we do have to be aware that this is a very full spectrum of things that we need to be able to meet. And I think including schemes like the one that we've talked about, area improvement schemes, house improvement schemes, and citywide schemes for improvements, as well as targets for new build, which I'm afraid we've rather been slightly lack at in this country, which is surprising considering the age of our building stock. We've more focused on the new build to be sustainable rather than looking at what we already have to be sustainable. And again, I think that we need to know what we're defining, what it works at. One thing I will be very, very cautious about when I bring in international standards, every country has a very clear cultural, economic, and environmental conditions it needs to meet. And we've got to be very careful of bringing an international system directly, without alteration, without consideration, into the UK context. That internationally has not worked very well. You just need to look at the LEED system being brought in Africa, which was an American system. It completely flopped in Africa, got completely erroneous results because the contexts were very different. So I think I do welcome new schemes, but I think you've got to understand the national and even at times the local context to make those truly sustainable. Alex, I'd like to hear what you say about the defining of zero carbon, because it's a really difficult one.
Oh, sorry.
Alex, did you want to jump in there, and then we're going to move across over to the toolkit?
Yeah, you know, it's a gap that needs to be filled. We need to define exactly what net zero carbon means, so we're all working on a level playing field. I know the Science Based Targets Initiative, they are consulting at the moment on a net zero carbon standard, and you know, if we can get agreement on what that means, you know, it would make things much more transparent and much fairer and much more of a level playing field for everyone. And you know, it gives everyone more credibility and more confidence then in exactly what it is that they're buying into.
Well, that's a really good point, and I think where people have confidence is when they have competence or toolkits where they can actually start to do this in a way that is effective. And I wanted to kind of come over to Safak and Chris actually, just to explore the toolkit a little bit further. And I wanted to start with Chris maybe, because, oh, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you as well.
Am I? Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, so Chris, you mentioned in your introduction that, you know, you would have found the toolkit quite helpful. And I just wondered your thoughts on how this could be used by contractors, and just to get your thoughts and reflections, really.
I think I echo Bob Heathfield's point in that at the moment, the industry is such that it comes down to pounds, pence, dollars and cents. And unless there is a way that this toolkit and the whole driver can be developed with the contractors on board, it's going to be quite challenging for a contractor to take it up unilaterally. There needs to be some consensus. As well, we also need to look at obvious conflicts in design terms. I think Alex's talk had have the quote that you want to make it light and bright, but from an acoustic point of view, that makes it very difficult in a residential environment because you can't keep noise out with glass. So there are obvious design conflicts that need to be worked through.